I think. You've heard about near-death experiences, I imagine, you know, the idea that people see the light at the end of the tunnel, and then, you know, when they get through the light, they see all their ancestors there, and something that vaguely resembles God, and, you know, and that's conditioned to some degree by their cultural background. But it's a very common experience, and this is actually a representation of that from a 12th to 13th century painting by Hieronymus Bosch. And this seems to be the sort of thing also that's characteristic of the shamanic experience post-reduction to skeleton. So the shaman dies, and then as a consequence of that, he ends up in a space that's characterized by the presence of the ancestral spirits, whatever that means. I mean, you could think about those as, like, each of you are embodiments of ancestral spirits, right? Because all the ideas you have, for example, none of them are your ideas, or virtually none of them. It's almost impossible to have an original idea. All the ideas you have are like the ghostly remnants of brilliant philosophers or theologians who've lived, you know, hundreds or thousands of years ago, and your whole head is populated by these things. And they're sort of embodied things because they tell you how to act. You know, they're not just cold, dead ideas. And you know, you're a mixture of all those things. And I don't know if the ancestral spirits that these visionaries encounter are like personified representations of the spirits that live inside their head or what they are, but part of the experience seems to be, what would you call it? It's like a rescuing of the dying father from the depths. So how many of you have seen Pinocchio? Right, so you know the fundamental theme there, right? Pinocchio is a marionette, so anyone can manipulate him. And he's a wooden head, he's not awake, he's not conscious, he's not alive, and so he can be led astray in 15 different ways. And, you know, finally his father disappears to go looking for him, and for reasons that aren't exactly clear, his father ends up inside a whale at the bottom of the ocean, which is, you know, not the first place you'd think of looking for your father. But especially if you were a puppet, and you know, like a cricket was leading you around, which is all absurd stuff, you know. Although one thing I could tell you is, what's the cricket's name? Yeah, what's the initials? Right, so fake, right? Yeah, Jiminy Cricket is Southern U.S. slang for Jesus Christ. And, you know, the animators picked that up as a joke. But it's not a joke, because of course the cricket serves as the conscience and the spiritual guide on this quest vision. And it's the cricket that leads the puppet deep underground. Actually, it's into the ocean, to the deepest depths of despair, right, and death, like a shamanic disintegration, to find the spirit of his father. And why does he need that? Well, it's because without incorporating the spirit of his father or his forefathers, he can't be real. And that's because human beings, and puppets apparently, you know, we're cultural creatures. It's not like there's you and there's your culture. It's like you are your culture. And so you're either the embodiment of your culture, fleshed out and made whole, or you're just a fragmentary thing and you're only half alive. And worse than that, you can't cope with tragedy. I mean, the way that Pinocchio becomes real is he rescues his father from the whale, which is also a dragon, right? The whale's a dragon. How do you know that? What happens to the whale? He spits fire. Yeah, it's weird behavior for a whale, you know, and it's because Pinocchio lights a fire inside him. But of course, you know, that's how human beings have always escaped from chaos, is by using fire. So he's the master of fire, and that brings him up from the depths, and he has to rescue his father, and it actually kills him, right? His father says, no, let me drown. Save yourself. Pinocchio doesn't, and he dies in the effort to bring him to shore. But then the blue fairy comes down and says, well, because you're such a good puppet, you know, it's like, great, now you're awake. You know, it's a remarkable story. It's an amazing movie. I mean, it has themes in it that are thousands and thousands of years old, like the idea that the hero has to journey to the darkest depths to reclaim a treasure. The treasure can be lots of things. It can be the dead father, it can be a princess, it can be gold. It doesn't really matter. There's this idea that, you know, the thing you want most is to be found where you least want to look, which is a lovely little, that's an alchemical dictum, by the way, that was sort of reanimated by Jung. So anyways, the idea in the shamanic visions is that past death, there's this opening up into the ancestral landscape, and that's the place where you can commune with, well, the ancestor gods, or maybe the spirit of the ancestors themselves, which is something like God. You know, if you look at the Christian representations, for example, one of the elements of God is God the Father. And so God the Father is sort of like an amalgam of all the great fathers of the past. You know, because you might say, well, what makes a person a great father? Well, careful, devoted attention would be part of it, right? that's a transpersonal thing. It's like if you're a great father and you are too, there's something about both of your actions as a great father that are the same. And you can think of that as the spirit of the great father. And that sort of shines through individuals. And so that's a way of communing with God through the ancestors. And that's part of what these rituals are about. I would like even now to stress the fact that the psychopathology of the shamanic vocation is not profane. It does not belong to ordinary symptomatology. It has an initiatory structure and signification. In short, it reproduces a traditional mystical pattern. The total crisis of the future shaman, sometimes leading to complete disintegration of the personality and to madness, can be evaluated not only as an initiatory death, but also as a symbolic return to the pre-cosmogonic chaos, to the amorphous and indescribable state that precedes any cosmogony. Well, that's a mouthful. So, one of the things I mentioned about this picture was that there's some inference, suggestion on the part of the artist that this chaotic monster of the depths has this origin point. It's like the beginning of time. It's like that's a symbol of the infinity that stretches on before us, and it emerges from that. And so part of the initiatory process is the dissolution of the personality. And the question is, well, what state of existence exists at the level where your personality dissolves? Because you see the world through your personality, and the world is given form through your personality, and then when it starts to dissolve and disintegrate, say when you sink into depression, it's that you're sinking into a state that's sort of before consciousness. So let me tell you something that William James said about this. So it's a very difficult thing to get to communicate. It's like, and we'll touch on it a bit more when we move into constructivism. So part of the idea here is that reality itself is extracted from the unknown and the unknowable. And you do that as individuals because there's all the parts of the world that you understand. And then there's the parts of the world that you don't understand, that you can't even conceive of. But now and then you encounter them, especially when you fail. And then you interact with them, and by doing that you make them like real and describable and experienceable. And so it's like there's this latent possibility that surrounds existence that you can interact with and pull up into actuality. And that's sort of that's like the action of consciousness on reality. That's why, by the way, in the beginning of Genesis, like in Genesis, it's the Word of God that produces order from chaos, right? And so that's the initiation of reality. And then later in Genesis, God makes human beings, and he says, you're made, both of you, in the image of God. And the question is, well, what does that mean? Well, it might mean that God has 2 arms and 2 legs, but what it seems to mean more accurately is that whatever it is that makes you conscious has this divine quality, and it's capable of extracting order continually from chaos. And by doing that, by being conscious actors in the world, you're bringing about the creation of reality. And that's a remarkable thing. And there's nothing mystical about that. You know perfectly well that you can make tomorrow one thing or another, And is that free will? Well, who knows? That question will never be solved. But it certainly seems phenomenologically like there's an option here for you, and there's an option here for you, and there's an option here for you. Those are all potential. And you can just choose which one of those you want to head towards and make actual. And that's consciousness doing that. And consciousness is something we don't have a clue about. And this is William James. William James is the father of pragmatic philosophy, but also of modern psychology. He did a fair bit of experimentation with nitrous oxide, which is this sort of inert gas that dentists use, for example, as an analgesic, but that also has quite profound hallucinatory and mystical experience-inducing properties. And so William James used to play with this. And this is a poem he wrote. I'll read you the description first from William James and then the poem. He said, "Pure experience is the name which I give to the original flux of life before reflection has categorized it. Only newborn babes and persons in semi-coma from sleep, drugs, illnesses, or blows can have an experience pure in the literal sense of that which is not yet any definite what, though ready to be all sorts of whats, full both of oneness and of manyness, but in respects that don't appear, changing throughout, yet so confusedly that its phases interpenetrate, and no points, either of distinction or of identity, can be caught." Yeah, well, it's sort of incoherent, but what William James is referring to is this idea that what the ground of reality is something like a potential from, a potential full of many possible actualities from which single actualities can be drawn, and that's what consciousness is doing when it makes decisions. And it's a brilliant idea, and I think, and I expect you to take this with a grain of salt, because this part of what I'm telling you about, well, you may think this about a lot of what I'm telling you is, sort of out on the fringes, but the quantum mechanics believe that the most accurate way to portray the ground of reality is as something that's striving to manifest itself. It's not there yet. It has to be interacted with something that's a conscious observer before it takes on tangible reality. And so the ground of being seems to be something like a multi-dimensional potential from which many things can emerge. And I actually think that is what we see when we look at the future. Because what the hell is the future? What is it? We certainly treat it as if it's real. The future is a place of potential. Well, right. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means, whatever it means is real enough so that you orient yourself by it. You take the future seriously. You believe that your choices bring future A or future B into being. You don't really know the limits of that. Like if you really got your act together, right down to the core, you have no idea what sort of glorious future you might be able to bring into existence. It's an unresolved question. If you diligently work with all of your effort, to perfecting the things around you, you have no idea how far you might be able to go. And it's a real open question, and I think that's part of what human beings have to bring against the sort of horrors of existence. Is like, you have a lot of potential. And if you made the right choices and were, awake and careful, God only knows what you might be able to manage. So, here's his poem. He sounds like a 60s hippie from Greenwich Village, really. It's written in like 1890. No verbiage can give it, because the verbiage is other, by which he means that whatever this potential is exists in a place before articulation. Right? Once it's articulated, it's not potential. It's all of a sudden something actual. That's actually why the ancient Jews didn't want to use the name of God. You weren't allowed to name God, because as soon as you named God, he was no longer God. God was the unnameable. And the Muslims have the same sort of idea about Muhammad in many ways. It's like you don't want to make a concrete representation, because then you take the ideal out of the ideal space and you start to make it something that you can, like a human construction. So, it's an idea that's got its merit.
Clean up your room. Then you'll know what to do next. I had a girl come up to me last night. She said, I started cleaning up my room, and it completely changed my life. She said, your room is an externalization of your mind. And that's right. That's exactly true.